In the remote wilderness of Maine, 3 women operated what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for more than 30 years. Over 600 women entered seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned home. Those who did came back changed. Within the Maine State Archives exists testimony from one survivor so disturbing that authorities refused to release it to the public for over a century. Tonight, we reveal what truly happened behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before continuing, this channel is not for everyone. It is only for the bravest souls willing to uncover the darkest chapters of American history. If you have the courage to hear what happened in the shadows of our past, subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery seekers? Let's find out together. What makes this story especially chilling is that it was not driven by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something far more terrifying: the calculated pursuit of knowledge at any human cost, hidden behind a facade of Christian charity. In the late 18th century, the District of Maine was still part of Massachusetts, a rugged wilderness where isolated communities struggled through brutal winters and even harsher realities. The coastal town of Milbridge, with a population of barely 300, served as a trading post for lumber merchants and fishermen daring enough to navigate the treacherous Atlantic waters. 15 miles inland, through dense forest marked only by Native American hunting trails, lay a tract of land that would become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The Ashford women arrived in Milbridge on a gray October morning in 1798. Their horse-drawn wagon, loaded with mysterious crates and medical supplies, drew curious glances from the townspeople. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down first, carrying herself with the bearing of European nobility. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and penetrating gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. Her voice bore the refined accent of educated English society, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to command and unquestioned obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford emerged next, a tall, gaunt woman of 30 with alabaster skin and hands that moved with the precise grace of a master craftsman. Her fingers were long and pale, marked by an unusual steadiness that would later prove essential to her gruesome work. Unlike her superior, Prudence spoke little, observing the world through pale blue eyes that revealed nothing of her thoughts. When she did speak, her cultured voice carried traces of a Scottish accent and an underlying coldness that unsettled even hardened frontiersmen. The youngest of the trio, Novice Temperance Ashford, appeared barely past 22. She possessed a haunting beauty that drew immediate attention: raven black hair, porcelain skin, and dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. Yet there was something deeply unsettling about her appearance, a quality that made mothers instinctively draw their children closer as she passed. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she had an unnerving habit of studying people, as though they were specimens in a collection. The Ashford women claimed to be Anglican nuns, fleeing religious persecution in England, seeking to establish a new order in the American wilderness. They carried impressive letters of recommendation from English church officials, documents that would later be exposed as masterful forgeries. Their story satisfied the Protestant community of Milbridge, which viewed the presence of educated religious women as a civilizing influence on their rough frontier settlement. With gold coins that seemed inexhaustible, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of remote forest land from a grateful widow struggling to pay her late husband's debts. The price, 3 times the land's assessed value, raised eyebrows but ensured eager cooperation from local authorities. They immediately hired every available carpenter, mason, and laborer in the region to construct their religious retreat. The structure that rose from the wilderness over the next 8 months was unlike any religious building the workers had ever seen. It stood 3 stories tall, built of gray stone quarried from the nearby coast, with walls thick enough to muffle any sound from within. The windows were unusually small and set high into the walls, making it impossible to see inside from ground level. Most peculiar was the basement, which required extensive excavation and reinforced foundations far beyond what would be necessary for simple storage. When questioned about the unusual design, Mother Superior Agatha explained with a serene smile that penitence required solitude, and solitude required proper containment. She said their sisters in England had learned that spiritual healing was most effective when the penitent was completely removed from worldly distractions. The explanation satisfied most listeners, though some older workers privately wondered why a house of God needed to resemble a fortress. The Ashford women supervised every detail of construction with meticulous care. They insisted on specific modifications that struck the builders as strange: reinforced doors with heavy locks, drainage systems capable of handling large volumes of liquid, and ventilation shafts more suited to a medical facility than a convent. When questioned, the sisters cited their experience with similar religious institutions in Europe, claiming these features were standard for intensive spiritual counseling. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a circuit physician who traveled between frontier settlements, became one of the sisters' earliest and most enthusiastic supporters. In his 50s, and known for progressive medical thinking, Hartwell was immediately impressed by the sisters' apparent knowledge of female psychology and mental disorders. During their first meeting, he was astonished by their sophisticated understanding of conditions most physicians barely acknowledged. The sisters possess remarkable insight into the nature of feminine hysteria and melancholia, he wrote in his journal. Their methods, though unconventional, are based on sound medical principles that are decades ahead of current American practice. They speak of addressing the root causes of mental disturbance rather than merely treating symptoms. What Dr. Hartwell did not record was a private conversation with Mother Superior Agatha regarding their financial arrangement. In exchange for referring difficult cases to the convent and supplying medical materials through his connections, Hartwell would receive a substantial monthly payment and access to detailed case studies that could further his career. For a physician struggling to survive on the frontier, the offer was impossible to refuse. The convent's reputation spread rapidly throughout the territory. Families from as far as Portsmouth, Portland, and even Boston heard whispered recommendations about the Ashford sisters' ability to transform troublesome women into model citizens. The cost was high: $20 silver for a month of treatment, $50 for 3 months, and $100 for what they called complete reformation. For desperate families dealing with scandalous daughters or hysterical wives, it seemed a small price to pay for peace and respectability. The women sent to the convent of Eternal Tears reflected the social anxieties of early 19th century America. Unmarried mothers who refused to name their lovers arrived alongside wives who had publicly challenged their husbands' authority. Daughters who rejected arranged marriages were delivered to the same institution as women who showed excessive interest in books or politics. The common thread was defiance: women who had stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior. Religious tensions of the era also shaped the convent's clientele. Puritan families sent daughters drawn to Anglican or Methodist teachings, while Anglican families disposed of daughters attracted to the emotional fervor of Baptist revivals. The Ashford sisters accepted women of all denominations, claiming their methods transcended sectarian differences through the universal power of Christian discipline. The first sign that something was deeply wrong at the convent of Eternal Tears came on a bitter February night in 1803. Thomas Brewster, a 20-year-old trapper, was hunting in the surrounding forest, tracking a wounded deer through the snow-laden wilderness, when strange sounds drew his attention toward the stone building looming against the winter sky. Thomas knew these woods well: the crack of ice-laden branches, the distant howl of wolves, the whisper of wind through pine needles. But what he heard that night was different, unmistakably human. Screams cut through the heavy air, rising and falling in waves, fading into desperate whimpers before erupting again into raw, primal shrieks of agony that froze his blood. Abandoning his prey, Thomas crept closer, his heart pounding as the sounds continued. The convent appeared dark from the outside, but as he moved toward the rear, he noticed a faint glow from basement windows, partially buried by snowdrifts. The screams intensified, accompanied by the clink of metal instruments, urgent whispered voices, and a sound disturbingly like sewing. Peering through a partially frosted basement window, Thomas witnessed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement had been transformed into a surgical theater, brightly lit by dozens of oil lamps and candles, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls. A woman was strapped to a wooden table, with leather restraints, her head immobilized by a metal apparatus, resembling a torture device more than medical equipment. Sister Prudence stood over the woman, her normally pale face flushed with concentration, as she worked with a long, thin metal rod. The patient's head had been partially shaved, exposing a pale scalp marked with dark, inked lines. Most horrifying of all, there was a clear opening in the woman's skull. Thomas could see the gleam of exposed bone and something darker beneath it, which he realized with sickening horror was brain tissue. The woman's eyes were wide with terror and pain, but what made the scene truly nightmarish was the clinical detachment of her tormentors. Mother Superior Agatha stood nearby with a notebook, calmly recording observations as though documenting a routine medical procedure. Novice Temperance held additional instruments, handing them to Sister Prudence with the practiced efficiency of an experienced surgical assistant. Thomas watched in frozen horror as Sister Prudence pushed the metal rod deeper into the woman's skull. The screaming rose to a crescendo that seemed to shake the stone walls, then abruptly stopped as the patient lost consciousness. The sisters continued their work with methodical precision, seemingly untroubled by the fact that the woman was no longer responsive. Unable to watch any longer, Thomas fled into the night, stumbling blindly through snowdrifts in sheer panic. The image of the basement chamber burned itself into his memory, the casual efficiency of the procedures, the scientific detachment of the perpetrators, and most terrifying of all, the realization that this was clearly not the first time such horrors had taken place within those stone walls. When Thomas reached town the next morning, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, babbling about torture chambers and brain surgery, with such frantic intensity that his father feared he had suffered a mental breakdown. The elder Brewster, a practical man who valued community stability above all else, listened with growing concern as his son described scenes that sounded more like Gothic fiction than a respectable religious institution. "Thomas," his father said carefully, "you were hunting alone in a blizzard in the dark, after tracking a wounded animal for hours. The mind can play terrible tricks under such circumstances. Perhaps what you witnessed was some form of medical procedure. The sisters are known to treat feminine ailments that require intimate intervention. But Thomas's account was too detailed and precise to be dismissed as confusion or hallucination. He could describe the layout of the basement chamber, the specific instruments he had seen, and, most convincingly, the cold clinical manner in which the procedures were carried out. This was not the chaotic violence of madness, but something far more sinister, systematic, deliberate, and clearly practiced. The elder Brewster decided to consult Deacon Morrison, the town's most respected citizen and unofficial moral authority. Morrison was a cautious man whose reputation rested on careful judgment and community harmony. For 5 years, the Ashford sisters had been model citizens, donating generously to local charities and maintaining impeccable decorum during their rare public appearances. More importantly, several prominent families currently had daughters and wives undergoing treatment at the convent. "We must be extremely careful," Deacon Morrison warned after hearing the story. "Accusations of this kind could ruin reputations and tear our community apart. These are respected women of God, not criminals. There must be a reasonable explanation for what the boy believes he saw." Still, Morrison was too responsible to ignore the allegations entirely. He agreed to make a discreet inquiry, visiting the convent the following week under the pretense of discussing a church fundraising event that would require the sisters' participation. Mother Superior Agatha received him in the convent's austere parlor, a sparsely furnished room dominated by a large wooden crucifix and religious paintings that seemed to watch visitors with judging eyes. Her manner was perfectly gracious and composed, showing no hint of anxiety or guilt as she served tea and inquired after his family's health with apparent sincerity. When Deacon Morrison cautiously mentioned reports from hunters about unusual nighttime noises, Mother Superior Agatha displayed only mild concern. "Deacon Morrison," she said in her refined English accent. "We often conduct intensive prayer sessions for our most troubled residents during the quiet hours of the night. Spiritual cleansing can be a vocal process, particularly for women who have lived lives of sin and moral corruption." She explained that many of their patients arrived in states of severe spiritual distress, possessed by demons of pride, lust, and rebellion that resisted the purifying power of Christian discipline. "Some souls," she said with sympathetic sadness, "were so deeply corrupted that extraction required great effort." The sounds the hunters heard, she assured him, were likely the cries of demons being cast out through prayer and penance. The explanation was delivered with such sincerity and theological sophistication that Deacon Morrison found himself nodding in agreement. The concept of spiritual warfare was familiar to frontier Christians, and the idea that deeply corrupted souls might require extreme measures for salvation did not seem unreasonable within the beliefs of the time. Mother Superior Agatha then offered to show him further. Mother Superior Agatha led him through the upper levels of the convent, guiding him past Spartan yet immaculately clean dormitory rooms, where several women sat in silent contemplation. The residents appeared calm and deeply absorbed in prayer or meditation, though Deacon Morrison noticed they were unusually subdued, moving with mechanical precision rather than natural human ease. When he attempted to meet their eyes, they seemed to look past him instead of at him, though their attention was fixed on something invisible in the distance. When the deacon asked about visiting the basement levels, Mother Superior Agatha explained that those areas served as intensive spiritual counseling facilities for women, requiring the most focused care. "It would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures," she said with a modest smile. "Some treatments for feminine spiritual corruption required private examination of the soul that would compromise a patient's dignity if observed by male eyes." The explanation aligned with the social conventions of the time, and Deacon Morrison left the convent feeling reassured that Thomas Brewster had misunderstood what he had seen. Yet during the ride home, something continued to trouble him, a subtle wrongness he could not clearly identify but could not dismiss. The women he had observed were too quiet, too controlled, moving with an unnatural uniformity that reminded him more of sleepwalkers than conscious human beings. There had also been a smell throughout the building that he could not quite place. Not merely the expected scent of medicine and cleaning agents, but something beneath it, something that reminded him uncomfortably of the battlefield hospitals he had visited during the Revolutionary War, where the stench of blood and suffering had been so thick it seemed to coat the inside of his throat. After Deacon Morrison's visit, the Ashford sisters implemented additional security measures, making their work even more secretive. The loud screams that had once alerted Thomas Brewster were replaced by an eerie silence that felt more ominous than the earlier nighttime disturbances. Local families continued sending troubled women to the convent, and the sisters continued receiving them with open arms and increasingly elaborate promises of transformation. Observant residents, however, began to notice disturbing patterns suggesting that something was fundamentally wrong with the treatments administered behind those stone walls. Women who entered the convent for spiritual correction often returned months later as entirely different people, not reformed or redeemed, but altered in ways that defied explanation. Mary Prescott had been a spirited 19-year-old known throughout Millbridge for her quick wit, infectious laughter, and stubborn independence. She had scandalized her family by refusing 3 marriage proposals from suitable young men. Mortified by her willfulness, her parents sent her to the convent for 6 months of spiritual guidance to prepare her for proper married life. When Mary returned home, her parents were initially delighted. The rebellious daughter, who had argued about everything from household duties to religious doctrine, was gone. In her place stood a docile, blank-eyed woman who spoke only when addressed and never expressed personal opinions or desires. She accepted the first marriage proposal offered with mechanical compliance, showing no emotion or preference. As weeks passed, her parents grew increasingly alarmed. Mary showed no recognition of favorite foods, cherished possessions, or childhood friends. When shown letters she had written before her confinement, she stared at them without comprehension, as though they belonged to a stranger. Most disturbing of all, she exhibited no emotional response of any kind. Neither joy nor sorrow, pleasure nor pain seemed to register. When consulted, Dr. Hartwell praised the sisters' work as a complete success. The patient had been cured of the mental defects that made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood, he declared. The rebellious spirit that caused her family such distress had been eliminated through proper spiritual discipline. Mary's mother, however, noticed troubling details. Her daughter bore unusual scars on her scalp, partially hidden by her hair but visible during washing and brushing. The marks formed a pattern suggesting a deliberate procedure rather than accidental injury. When questioned, Mary had no memory of how the scars were acquired, stating only that she remembered praying very hard at the convent to become a better woman. Similar transformations became increasingly common as the convent's reputation spread throughout New England. Hannah Morse, sent for treatment of melancholia after the death of her infant son, returned home 3 months later unnaturally cheerful, claiming to have no memory of ever having had a child. When shown the baby's clothing and toys, she displayed no recognition or emotional response, as though that entire chapter of her life had been completely erased from her memory. Elizabeth Thornton's case was perhaps the most disturbing. The merchant's wife had been committed to the convent for hysteria after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce. Behavior considered scandalous and threatening to the family's social standing. When she returned after 4 months of treatment, she not only retracted her accusations, but insisted she had never made them. More troubling still, she appeared to have no memory of the events that led to her confinement, describing her marriage as perfectly happy and her husband as beyond reproach. Elizabeth's physical condition raised further concern. She suffered from severe headaches that left her bedridden for days at a time. Family members noticed increasing confusion. She forgot the names of longtime friends, became lost in familiar neighborhoods, and struggled with simple tasks that had once been second nature. Like the other reformed women, she bore mysterious scars on her scalp and claimed no memory of how they were acquired. Dr. Hartwell continued to offer enthusiastic support for the Ashford methods, though his own behavior grew increasingly erratic. The once respected physician began drinking heavily and frequently launched into rambling monologues about advancing medical science and the sacrifices required for the greater good of humanity. Journal entries discovered after his death reveal a man torn by conscience yet determined to justify increasingly horrific actions. The procedures I have witnessed challenge every principle of medical ethics I was taught, he wrote. Yet the results are undeniable. The sisters have achieved what European physicians only theorize about, the ability to alter personality, suppress specific memories, and modify behavior through direct surgical intervention in the brain. Their documentation is meticulous, their methodology sound, and their results consistent and reproducible. History will judge whether we are pioneers advancing human knowledge or monsters exploiting human suffering. During this period, correspondence between the convent and various European medical institutions increased dramatically. Local postal workers, bound to silence by generous payments, could not help noticing the sheer volume of letters and packages bearing foreign addresses. The Ashford sisters received regular shipments of medical texts, surgical instruments, and chemical compounds, while sending out detailed reports and what appeared to be preserved biological specimens. Mother Superior Agatha began making monthly trips to Portland and Boston, returning each time with carefully handled crates of supplies and equipment. To curious locals, she explained that the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments for feminine mental disorders, blending traditional spiritual healing with the latest advances in European medical science. Her refined manner and evident education made these claims seem credible to a community that valued both religious faith and scientific progress. Still, some residents remained deeply suspicious of the changes they observed in the convent's patients. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca returned from treatment, fundamentally altered, quietly began questioning other families. She uncovered a disturbing pattern. None of the women who had undergone intensive treatment in the basement facilities could remember anything about their time at the convent beyond fragments of prayers and religious instruction. Martha's inquiries revealed another troubling fact. Several women had never returned at all. When families asked about their missing daughters or wives, the Ashford sisters claimed the women had experienced such profound spiritual awakenings that they chose to remain as permanent residents, devoting their lives to prayer and service. Families who requested visits were politely but firmly refused, told that the women had taken strict vows of silence and seclusion that forbade contact with their former lives. The mystery deepened when Martha learned that the convent was accepting women from increasingly distant places. Wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, and even Charleston were sending their most troublesome daughters to the remote institution, willing to pay substantial sums and travel great distances for the promise of complete transformation. Fees rose accordingly, with the sisters charging up to $500 for what they called comprehensive reformation, a 6-month process guaranteeing the permanent elimination of all undesirable traits. As the convent entered its second decade of operation, the Ashford sisters had established themselves as recognized authorities on feminine mental disorders within medical communities in both America and Europe. Their carefully constructed reputation began attracting the attention of some of the most prominent physicians and researchers of the era. They attracted the attention of men fascinated by the detailed case studies and remarkable success rates described in the sisters' regular correspondence with medical institutions. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School became one of their most devoted correspondents, maintaining a steady exchange of letters for more than 15 years. In communications preserved in the Harvard archives, he expressed astonishment at the sophistication of their work. "Your documentation of behavioral modification techniques surpasses anything I have encountered in contemporary European literature," he wrote. "The precision with which you correlate specific physical interventions with predictable personality changes suggests a level of understanding our profession will not achieve for decades." What Dr. Whitmore did not realize was that he was reading clinical descriptions of procedures that would later be recognized as primitive forms of lobotomy, trepanation, and systematic brain damage. The Ashford sisters had developed an advanced understanding of cranial anatomy and brain function through years of unrestricted experimentation on human subjects, accumulating knowledge that legitimate researchers could only speculate about through animal studies and post-mortem examinations. Their research methodology was disturbingly thorough. They kept detailed records of each patient's personality traits, behavioral patterns, and psychological characteristics prior to treatment, then documented every aspect of their experimental procedures with scientific precision. Post-treatment observations tracked changes in memory, personality, cognitive ability, and behavior with the same meticulous care found in legitimate medical research. Their surgical techniques evolved significantly during this period. Sister Prudence became highly skilled in what she called targeted cranial intervention, developing methods to access specific regions of the brain through carefully calculated entry points. Anatomical drawings, discovered decades later, revealed multiple approaches to different brain structures, complete with precise measurements and angles that demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of cranial anatomy. The procedures themselves were carried out with a level of clinical detachment that made them even more horrifying. Patients were usually sedated with laudanum or other opiates, but never enough to render them fully unconscious. The sisters required their subjects to remain responsive so they could observe the effects of their interventions in real time. They asked questions, issued commands, and carefully noted behavioral changes as they manipulated different areas of the brain with their instruments. Novus Temperance evolved into the group's specialist in what they termed psychological conditioning and behavioral reconstruction. She designed elaborate protocols to reinforce the effects of surgery through structured systems of reward and punishment, sensory manipulation, and sustained psychological pressure. Her methods included controlled diets, sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and prolonged isolation, all calibrated to dismantle existing personality structures and rebuild them according to desired specifications. The sisters also pioneered the use of chemical compounds to enhance their experimental outcomes. Through their network of medical contacts, they obtained substances unavailable to mainstream medicine for decades. They tested various drug combinations, carefully documenting their effects on consciousness, memory, and susceptibility to psychological manipulation with the same systematic rigor applied to their surgical work. By 1815, more than 400 women had passed through the convent's treatment programs. The sisters maintained detailed statistical records, claiming success rates exceeding 90%, though success was defined as the complete elimination of the traits or behaviors that led to a patient's confinement. Women who died during treatment were classified as failures, and their bodies were preserved for further study. The scale of their operations expanded dramatically. They began accepting what they called research volunteers, typically destitute women with no family connections, who were offered food, shelter, and modest compensation in exchange for participation in experimental treatments intended to advance understanding of the feminine mind. These women, often prostitutes, vagrants, or widows without means of support, became subjects for the sisters' most extreme procedures. Documentation later uncovered in hidden archives throughout the convent reveals a systematic approach to human experimentation that was both methodical and horrifying. The sisters recorded precise skull measurements, detailed descriptions of brain tissue reactions to various stimuli, and careful observations linking specific surgical interventions to behavioral outcomes. They also maintained extensive correspondence with researchers across Europe and America, selling their findings to medical institutions unwilling or unable to conduct such studies themselves. These letters reveal a thriving black market in human experimentation data, with the Ashford sisters serving as primary suppliers of information that could not be obtained through legitimate research methods. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna became one of the sisters' most lucrative clients, paying substantial sums for detailed documentation on personality modification through surgical intervention. Letters intercepted decades later revealed that he specifically requested information on eliminating targeted memories, reducing emotional responsiveness, and creating what he described as compliant behavioral states in female subjects. The University of Edinburgh, ironically the same institution that had expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan years earlier, unknowingly purchased research data from its former colleague through intermediaries who concealed the true source. The university's medical school incorporated the Ashford findings into its curriculum, teaching surgical techniques and psychological theories rooted in systematic human experimentation conducted in the Maine wilderness. Most chilling of all, the sisters began accepting commissions for specific forms of behavioral modification. Wealthy families could request tailored changes in their troublesome relatives, the removal of artistic tendencies, suppression of intellectual curiosity, elimination of romantic attachments, or the creation of perfect domestic compliance. The sisters developed specialized procedures for each request, charging premium fees for their increasingly refined services. The carefully maintained Phi Aid that had protected the Ashford sisters for nearly 2 decades began to crack in the winter of 1818 with the arrival of a young woman named Sarah Whitman. Unlike the broken and desperate women who usually came to the convent, Sarah arrived as a fighter, armed with intelligence and a strength of will that had not been crushed by social pressure. Sarah's offense was giving birth to a child out of wedlock and steadfastly refusing to name the father, despite months of pressure from her wealthy Boston family. Her parents, prominent merchants anxious to preserve their reputation, first attempted to arrange a discreet marriage or adoption. When Sarah rejected both, insisting on keeping her child and living independently, they declared her mentally unstable and arranged her commitment to the Convent of Eternal Tears. At 24, Sarah possessed a formidable intellect nurtured by progressive parents until her pregnancy rendered her an embarrassment. She had received an unusually broad education for a woman of her time, including exposure to medical texts through her father's connections with Boston physicians. This knowledge would prove critical in recognizing the true nature of the Ashford sisters' work. From the moment she arrived, Sarah understood the convent was not what it seemed. The residents moved with mechanical precision, their responses unnaturally controlled and their eyes disturbingly vacant. Many bore visible scars on their scalps, partially hidden by regrown hair over surgical sites. Most telling were the clear signs of brain damage, speech difficulties, memory loss, and personality changes so severe they appeared to be entirely different people. Sarah's medical knowledge allowed her to identify these symptoms as the results of deliberate surgical intervention in the brain. During her first week, she underwent the same preliminary examinations that preceded all intensive treatments, precise skull measurements, exhaustive questioning about her personality and behavior, and physical tests designed to map neurological responses rather than assess spiritual well-being. The Ashford sisters were unsettled by Sarah's resistance to their standard conditioning methods. Most patients, already shattered by shame and family rejection, quickly submitted to the convent's authority. Sarah did not. She maintained her defiance even as the sisters escalated their efforts to break her psychological defenses in preparation for more invasive intervention. She was confined in isolation for days, deprived of adequate food and water, and subjected to prolonged psychological abuse, meant to destroy her sense of self-worth. Sister Temperance employed every technique at her disposal: sensory deprivation, exposure to temperature extremes, sleep disruption, and relentless verbal attacks on Sarah's character and humanity. Despite this, Sarah remained alert and determined to escape. During her isolation, she memorized the convent's layout, studied the sisters' routines, and planned her eventual flight. She also began documenting everything she observed in a makeshift journal, writing on scraps of paper with ink made from crushed berries, and hiding the pages within the seams of her clothing. Sarah's opportunity came during a violent thunderstorm in March 1819, when flooding in the basement disrupted the convent's normal operations. The sisters were forced to move equipment and patients to higher floors, creating chaos that gave Sarah the opportunity she had been waiting for. Amid the confusion of relocating materials and managing the crisis, she slipped away from her guards and ventured into areas of the building that were normally forbidden to patients. What she discovered in the basement chambers exceeded her worst fears. The flooded rooms revealed evidence of procedures beyond comprehension: operating tables fitted with restraints designed to completely immobilize patients, collections of surgical instruments unlike anything used in conventional medicine, and most horrifying of all, glass jars containing preserved human brain tissue, each carefully labeled with patient names, dates, and procedural notes. The surgical records she found documented deliberate brain damage, carried out with scientific precision. Notes described the systematic removal of tissue from specific brain regions, accompanied by careful observations of resulting changes in personality, memory, and behavior. Some entries included detailed sketches of open skulls and anatomical diagrams marking the exact locations of surgical interventions. Most damning was the extensive correspondence she uncovered. Letters from European physicians purchasing the sisters' research data for large sums of money. The exchanges discussed experimental results and anatomical specimens with the casual indifference of ordinary business transactions. It was clear the convent was operating as a commercial enterprise, selling the results of human experimentation to researchers unwilling or unable to conduct such studies themselves. Armed with this knowledge and samples of documentation she managed to conceal on her body, Sarah began planning her escape with desperate urgency. She knew she was scheduled for intensive treatment within days, and understood it. It would likely leave her as damaged as the other women she had observed. Her time was running out, and the sisters were growing increasingly suspicious of her continued resistance. Her escape came on a moonless night in early April 1819, when Sarah overpowered a guard and fled into the surrounding forest. The Ashford sisters immediately organized a massive search, knowing she carried information capable of destroying their carefully constructed facade and exposing decades of criminal activity. For 3 harrowing days, Sarah evaded capture as she made her way through the wilderness toward the nearest settlement, surviving on spring water and whatever edible plants she could identify. The pursuit was relentless and well organized. The sisters knew the terrain well and had the resources to mount a coordinated manhunt, enlisting local men under the guise of searching for a mentally disturbed woman who might harm herself. Sarah could hear her pursuers throughout her flight, their voices echoing through the forest as they systematically searched every possible hiding place. On the second night, she narrowly avoided recapture when she stumbled into a search party while seeking shelter from a sudden rainstorm. Only quick thinking and her knowledge of the forest, gained during childhood visits to her grandfather's logging camp, allowed her to escape detection. She spent the remainder of the night hiding inside a fallen tree, listening as her pursuers searched the surrounding area. By the third day, Sarah's physical condition had deteriorated badly. She was dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from exposure to the harsh April weather. Her feet were bleeding from walking barefoot across rough terrain, and she was beginning to show signs of hypothermia. Still, her determination to reach safety and expose the Ashford sisters' crimes drove her forward despite her body's protests. Her breakthrough came when she encountered a trapper named Joshua Meadows while he was checking his lines in the early morning hours. Initially wary of the wild-looking woman emerging from the forest, Joshua's attitude changed when Sarah began describing specific details about the convent that only someone with first-hand knowledge could know. Her desperation was real, her injuries undeniable, and her account too detailed and consistent to dismiss as madness. Joshua gave Sarah food, warm clothing, and, most importantly, safe passage to the sheriff's office in Millbridge. Even as they traveled, Sarah remained terrified that the Ashford sisters would reach her before she could speak to the authorities. She had seen enough to know their influence and resources extended far beyond the isolated walls of the convent. When Sarah Whitman finally reached Sheriff William Hawthorne's office in Millbridge on April 18, 1819, her appearance and extraordinary claims were met with the same skepticism that had greeted Thomas Brewster's account 16 years earlier. Sheriff Hawthorne, a practical man who valued steady judgment, initially assumed he was dealing with another victim of wilderness exposure and mental collapse. Sarah's account of systematic human experimentation sounded too unbelievable to accept and too horrific to contemplate. Several factors, however, set her testimony apart from that of a disturbed wanderer. Most notably, her detailed knowledge of the convent's interior matched information that had never been made public. She could describe not only the overall structure of the building, but precise details of the basement chambers, the placement of equipment, and the locations of hidden storage areas, knowledge only someone with prolonged internal access could possess. More compelling still were the documents Sarah had stolen during her escape. These included surgical notes, correspondence with European medical institutions, and patient records that provided concrete proof of the Ashford sisters' activities. Written in clinical language, the documents described procedures that would be considered war crimes by modern standards and left no doubt about the systematic nature of the atrocities carried out at the convent. The first document was a surgical log detailing procedures performed on 23 women over an 8-month period. The entries were recorded with scientific precision, describing operations that involved drilling into patients' skulls and inserting instruments to damage or remove specific areas of brain tissue. Each case included preoperative personality assessments, surgical descriptions of the exact methods used, and post-operative observations tracking changes in behavior, memory, and cognitive ability. One especially chilling entry described the case of Margaret Fowler, a 19-year-old woman committed for excessive reading and intellectual curiosity deemed inappropriate for her sex. The surgical notes outlined a procedure intended to damage brain regions associated with learning and memory, with the stated goal of reducing the patient's compulsive interest in books and abstract thought while preserving basic domestic abilities. The post-operative observations documented the grim success of the procedure. Margaret's love of reading was entirely eliminated. Her vocabulary was severely reduced, and her capacity for complex reasoning was profoundly impaired. The entry concluded with approval that the patient now displayed appropriate feminine docility and showed no interest beyond basic household tasks. The second document was even more damning, a correspondence file containing letters from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating the purchase of cranial intervention research for the sum of 4,000 Austrian florins. The letters specifically requested documentation of techniques for erasing unwanted memories and personality traits through surgical alteration of brain structure. Dr. Zimmerman's correspondence revealed an international network of researchers purchasing data derived from human experimentation conducted by the Ashford sisters. Universities in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris were receiving regular reports detailing procedures that would have been forbidden under any civilized legal system. The sisters were effectively operating as commercial suppliers of information that legitimate researchers could not obtain through ethical means. The third document was perhaps the most horrifying of all, a patient catalog listing more than 600 women processed through the convent's various programs since 1798. The catalog was organized by treatment type and included detailed annotations describing the procedures performed and each patient's final outcome. Most entries were marked, reformed and returned, referring to women who had undergone surgical modification and been sent back to their families with altered personalities. A smaller number were listed as permanent residents, women said to have chosen to remain at the convent, though their current whereabouts were unspecified. Most disturbing were nearly 200 entries marked simply expired, indicating women who had died during or shortly after experimental procedures. Faced with this overwhelming evidence, Sheriff Hawthorne realized he was confronting crimes beyond anything he had encountered before. He immediately organized a raid on the convent, assembling a force of 15 armed men for what he now understood would be far more than a routine arrest. He also sent urgent messages to authorities in Portland and Boston, requesting assistance from federal marshals who would have jurisdiction over crimes of this scale. The Ashford sisters, however, were monitoring developments through their network of informants in Millbridge. By the time the raiding party arrived at the convent, on the morning of May 20, 1819, the building stood completely abandoned. The sisters had disappeared during the night, taking most of their portable equipment and records with them, and leaving behind only what they could not carry. The search of the abandoned convent revealed a chamber of horrors that even the most hardened members of the raiding party found deeply disturbing. The basement contained a fully equipped surgical theater, stocked with instruments specifically designed for cranial procedures. Shelves along the walls held hundreds of preserved brain specimens, each meticulously labeled with patient names, dates, and detailed notes on the experiments conducted. Behind a false wall, investigators discovered a hidden chamber containing 47 bodies, all in varying states of preservation and showing clear evidence of cranial surgery. The corpses had been submerged in a solution of alcohol and other chemicals, presumably for ongoing study. Each body bore tags with comprehensive records of the procedures performed and the results observed prior to death. Left behind in the sisters' hurried departure were file cabinets crammed with thousands of pages of surgical notes, patient records, and correspondence with medical institutions across the globe. The scale of their operation was staggering. The Ashford sisters had been conducting systematic human experimentation for over 20 years, documenting procedures that mainstream medicine would not recognize for decades. When confronted with evidence of his involvement, Dr. Samuel Hartwell initially attempted to justify his complicity, claiming he had been advancing medical science for the good of humanity. These women were already lost to society, he argued, desperately insisting that their suffering had at least contributed to knowledge that might benefit future generations. However, faced with the full extent of the experimentation and the evidence of systematic murder, disguised as medical treatment, Hartwell appeared to suffer a complete mental collapse. In his final confession, given under guard in the Millbridge jail, he revealed the true identities of the Ashford sisters and their criminal past. The women known as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novus Temperance Ashford were in fact Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford, trained physicians expelled from European medical institutions for conducting unauthorized human experiments. Dr. Brennan had been banned from practicing medicine in Scotland after several patients died during her experiments attempting to correct feminine hysteria through surgical intervention. Dr. Prudence Ashford had been dismissed from the University of Edinburgh Medical School after conducting illegal experiments on asylum patients to map brain function through systematic cranial damage. The youngest, Dr. Temperance Ashford, had been her sister's student, learning psychological conditioning techniques designed to amplify the effects of surgical procedures. The three women had fled Europe in 1797, adopting false identities as Anglican nuns to continue their research without oversight or legal constraints. Over more than 20 years, they perfected techniques to alter human behavior through surgical intervention, amassing knowledge that legitimate researchers could only dream of acquiring. The manhunt for the escaped sisters became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in early American history, involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and international coordination with European authorities. Yet the women vanished completely, leaving behind only the horrifying evidence of their decades-long human experimentation. Investigators discovered that the sisters had maintained multiple escape routes from the convent and had accumulated vast wealth from their illicit activities. Bank records revealed transfers exceeding 50,000 over the years to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and Europe, an amount worth millions today. They had also established false identities in safe houses across North America and Europe, indicating their plans for eventual escape had been in place from the start. Shipping records showed that months before Sarah's flight, they had been gradually moving equipment and documentation out of the convent, preparing for the possibility of discovery. The full scope of their crimes came into sharp focus. Over 21 years, the Ashford sisters had processed more than 600 women through their experimental programs. Approximately 250 were returned to their families as successfully treated patients, though all exhibited signs of brain damage consistent with surgical intervention. Another 50 were listed as permanent residents, women supposedly choosing to remain at the convent, yet no trace of them was ever found. The remaining victims, nearly 200, had been killed during or shortly after the experimental procedures, their fates deliberately concealed by the sisters. The search of the abandoned convent uncovered a chamber of horrors that shook even the most seasoned members of the raiding party. The basement contained a fully outfitted surgical theater, complete with instruments designed specifically for cranial procedures. Shelves lining the walls were filled with hundreds of preserved brain specimens, each meticulously labeled with the patient's name, date, and detailed notes on the experiments performed. Behind a false wall, investigators discovered a hidden chamber containing 47 bodies in various states of preservation, all showing evidence of cranial surgery. Submerged in alcohol and other chemicals, these corpses appeared to have been maintained for ongoing study, each tagged with comprehensive information about the procedures performed and the results observed before death. In addition to the bodies, investigators found a massive trove of documentation abandoned in the sisters' hasty flight. File cabinets contained thousands of pages of surgical notes, patient records, and correspondence with medical institutions across the globe. The scale of the operation was staggering. The Ashford sisters had been conducting systematic human experimentation for more than 20 years, recording procedures that mainstream medicine would not acknowledge for decades. When confronted with his complicity, Dr. Samuel Hartwell initially tried to defend his role, claiming he had been advancing medical science for the benefit of humanity. These women were already lost to society, he argued, insisting their suffering at least contributed to knowledge that could aid future generations. Yet when presented with the full scope of the experimentation and the evidence of systematic murder disguised as treatment, Hartwell appeared to suffer a complete mental collapse. In his final confession, delivered under guard in the Millbridge jail, he revealed the sisters' true identities and the extent of their crimes. Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novice Temperance Ashford were in fact Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford, physicians expelled from European medical institutions for conducting unauthorized human experiments. Dr. Brennan had been banned from practicing medicine in Scotland after several patients died during her surgical interventions designed to correct feminine hysteria. Dr. Prudence Ashford had been dismissed from the University of Edinburgh Medical School after performing illegal experiments on asylum patients, systematically damaging cranial regions to map brain function. The youngest, Dr. Temperance Ashford, had trained under her sisters, learning psychological conditioning techniques to enhance the effects of surgical procedures. The three women had fled Europe in 1797, adopting false identities as Anglican nuns to continue their work without oversight. For over 20 years, they honed techniques for modifying human behavior through surgical intervention, gaining knowledge that legitimate researchers could only dream of. The manhunt for the sisters became one of the most extensive criminal investigations in early American history, involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and international coordination with European authorities. Yet the women vanished completely, leaving only the horrific evidence of their decades of experimentation. Investigators found that the sisters had maintained multiple escape routes from the convent and had amassed substantial wealth from their illicit activities. Bank records revealed transfers exceeding 50 of Zalavarzand over the years to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and Europe, a fortune worth millions today. They had also established false identities and safe houses across North America and Europe, indicating that their escape had been planned from the outset. Shipping records showed that months before Sarah's escape, they had been gradually moving equipment and documents from the convent, anticipating the possibility of discovery. The full scope of their crimes came into sharp focus over 21 years. The Ashford sisters had processed more than 600 women through their experimental programs. Approximately 250 were returned to their families as successfully treated patients, though all showed signs of brain damage consistent with surgical intervention. Another 50 were reported as permanent residents of the convent, yet no trace of these women was ever found. The sisters had apparently killed these patients when they outlived their usefulness or failed to conform to the desired behavioral modifications.